Previously on Reset Race.
What in your position are the big differences in terms of perspectives between Black Americans and Black Caribbeans?
I think for, well, the biggest thing is what you just said in terms of describing us as Black Caribbeans. Like, people don't describe themselves as black something. They would describe themselves like there are songs, like, it's not like there is no sense of that identity at all. You know, like, people care about that to a degree, but their primary identity is their ethnicity, which is different from their race. So that I would say is probably the biggest thing. The other thing is that I don't think they are so butthurt about. That sounds. I don't mean that in a disrespectful way, but they like it about things. Like, it might annoy them, you know. Like, they might think that, say, like, Trump is racist or something because of something they've heard, but it's not the end of the world.
And I think there's this unnecessarily narrow focus on racial privilege. And by the way, it's not even clear that people talk about white privilege as if it's a kind of gas that fills up the container of the country so that anywhere you are, it pays to be white rather than Black. But it's really context dependent. If you're applying to college, it's very useful to be Black at that moment. If you're applying for a job that has a diversity and inclusion program, it's very useful to be Black. And there are other contexts, others.
Kind of pause you. Yeah. Do you usually fill those things out? Because I definitely have, like, a moment of ethical questioning every single time I have to fill something out. Like, well, should I try to use this to my advantage, or should I stick by my principles, or should I just try to do the best for myself, or like, what's that like for you?
That's a very good question. I usually fill it out.
I don't usually. I usually, like, decline to answer.
I mean, I figure if I'm gonna get into this thing anyway, whatever it is, if I don't fill it out, they'll just go even deeper into the pool of applicants to satisfy their. Well, I guess they claim to not do quotas anymore, but in effect, it's just the same.
Coleman Hughes is clearly trying to present some quote-unquote reverse racism narrative where Black people have some great advantage in American society. This is clearly not the case, but we'll get into that a little bit later. His co-conspirator over here, now, she said something that I think is kind of interesting. And it's interesting to me because I believe that even though we don't have the same motivations, we somehow landed on a similar conclusion. In her mind, affirmative action is probably some way for Black people to game the system and get some unfair advantage. So she looks at it as if she's taking some moral stance to not partake. From my perspective, affirmative action was intended for the people who were locked out of the system. And that is the people who were affected by Jim Crow laws. If you have no connection to those people, then you should not benefit from affirmative action.
What about you, sir? Do you think the college students will show up?
If I got anything to do with it, they won't show up.
There's something I wanted to say when you were talking about the privilege. I wanted to say that we need to stop. In my opinion, I would really like it if the societal discourse around privilege and inequality, and those who need welfare, any kind of welfare that could be, it's mostly monetary because monetary value can buy everything else. I think that we should just focus on those specific traits. And when we're doing all these statistical comparisons, they always divide the population into racial categories, but I think we should just divide it into the particular thing we're concerned with. And I think you've talked about this stuff before, but I would really like to see society go into this direction of, if you want to look at how poverty affects the country, look at poverty. Maybe you will get like twice as many black people who are poor when you're looking at poverty, but you're looking at poverty, so you'll capture all the other people too who aren't black, who fit into that.
Welfare is not based on race. Welfare is based on income. Now, as far as how our government records statistics, it has always recorded these things by race because the American government has racialized its citizens. And to be clear, before the founding of this country, the white people who settled on this land created categories to determine who was to be exploited. So America continued this racialized caste system, which allowed it to provide unequal resources to the people under its governance, and unequal treatment under the law based on race. And the American government is probably going to continue to record statistics by race until there is actually a concerted effort to bring black people who descend from American chattel slavery to parity with the rest of American society.
Yeah, but
It doesn't
I
make
don't know.
sense.
When I think about black people suffering in the world, I do not think about Americans. I think.
So you are in America, but you think about the suffering that black people experience everywhere on the globe, except for the suffering that we experience here in America.
Instead of critiquing us, come help us, and you will see that we need help, bad.
Mostly about like really poor countries, or say like in Africa, not to offend anyone. I know there are many Africans who aren't suffering, or poor people in Jamaica. Like I almost don't think of Americans, because I'm sure that there are Americans who suffer too. But it's almost like it doesn't tick me off, but it's almost as if there are people who are doing so well who are complaining. And I remember kind of mentioning something like this to you before. It's all relative, so you don't know what you have.
We are complaining because we know what we don't have. We don't have the same quality of life as other Americans, even though the exploitation of our people's labor is what has allowed Americans to have such a high quality of life. It is very interesting how this comparison works, especially when we're hearing it from people whose whole politics is about running away from this black identity. Why is it we can't talk about our suffering in terms of being compared to other Americans? Why is it that when we talk about our suffering, we have to be compared to black people all across the globe? I don't live in any other country. I live in America. Compare my social economic status to other Americans.
That's it. Yeah. That's a good point. I think I agree with that. I think the notion of privilege is very much in vogue nowadays, and I think especially white privilege. I think white privilege is one of 1,000 different kinds of privilege in life. To the extent that it exists, to the extent that it is an advantage to be white in America rather than black, which is arguable.
Or other colors. Everybody always forgets that there are other people.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, to the extent that is a useful way of thinking about the intersection of privilege and race, which I'm not sure that it is, that's just one of 100 or 1,000 different ways in which a person can be privileged. You can, there's health privilege. You can be healthy or not. You can be born into money or not. Mm-hmm. We know at this point that every trait that matters to your success in life is deeply determined by genetics. Not completely, of course, but genetics often explains 50% or more of the variance in psychological traits, whether it's intelligence or openness to experience, other elements of the person's personality. That is privilege. If they're ever, if we're going to talk about privilege, we should talk about privilege. We should talk about all the kinds of privilege that, in my view, completely swamp the effect of skin color privilege.
Right.
I mean, like what privileges? I've had privileges that I know so many of my white friends don't. Mm-hmm. So whether it can be money, but it's just beyond that. I know that, for example, I enjoy working. I enjoy writing. I was good at math from the first moment I tried it in kindergarten. That was not hard work. That was not grit. It was not merit. It was good luck. It was my parents were also good at math. And that's how my mom got out to South Bronx and went to Stuyvesant and whatever. She was just good at it. People want to ascribe that to hard work, but hard work itself is something that is somewhat determined by luck. Your ability to work hard, your predilection for hard work is itself determined. So that's a kind of privilege too. It's privilege all the way down. And I think there's this unnecessarily narrow focus on racial privilege.
I am not a fan of the privilege discourse, and this is a prime example of why I'm not a fan of it. The terminology is very, very vague, and it's not really conveying the idea that we want to convey. When we are talking about white privilege, we are talking about white people's access to power, and we should talk about it in those terms, because that limits the space for any confusion in these discussions. And when you allow these things to be unclear, it allows our opposition to take advantage by playing semantic games.
There is an African American man. I am in Central Park. He is recording me and threatening myself and my dog.
So something I know you're interested in is the topic of affirmative action. Can you, I think I already know what your ideas are, but maybe I don't. Maybe there's something I don't fully understand. So could you share more about that?
It's a really complex topic to me. I think more and more I think about affirmative action in terms of trade-offs. This is Thomas Sowell's famous quip, "There are no solutions, there are only trade-offs." Actually, it's broader than Sowell. It's a principle of economics. There are no solutions in the condition of scarcity. There are only trade-offs. So we have competing trade-offs. We have the value of fairness, of procedural fairness on the one hand. Everyone plays by the same rules. This was more or less what the civil rights revolutionaries advocated. Bayard Rustin and Martin Luther King, for the most part, wanted black people to play by the same exact rules.
No, they wanted white people to govern based on the rules that they claimed to follow in the Constitution.
They wanted to end segregation. They did not want black kids getting into college, on average, getting 300 points on the SAT lower than white kids. They wanted...
So here are the black-white SAT stats. There is nowhere near a 300-point difference. Clearly, Coleman Hughes is full of shit.
They wanted black kids to compete on the exact same playing field, right? So there's fairness on the one hand, which I have deep sympathy for. Mm-hmm. And on the other hand, there is the value of diversity, which I don't write diversity off. I think there is something to diversity. I don't think it trumps every other. I don't think it's a master value. I think it's value to be traded up.
What do you think? What's the value in diversity?
Well, I'm thinking to myself, would going to Harvard be a better or worse experience if 100% of Harvard students were, let's say, white Protestants from Oregon? Mm-hmm. That was the whole school. Would that be a better or worse place to go to school, holding everything else equal in this thought experiment? even though that's a little artificial. I think that would be a less rich experience. So any deviation away from that circumstance is what diversity is. So to achieve that in a condition where not every group is producing as the same number of qualified candidates, you have to trade off against fairness.
Okay, I'm sorry. Sorry, hold on. I know you want to continue more with the other things that are important, but to the diversity thing, do you think that when you're describing diversity, are you only talking about this ethnic diversity? Because there's so many different levels of diversity, and I think once you achieve one kind of diversity, you lose another kind of diversity. So I feel as if you almost shouldn't focus on diversity at all, because if you focus on it, you can always approach it from a different angle of what you're trying to make varied, what variable you're trying to vary.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. That's why I said white Protestants from Oregon. Mm-hmm. So I'm getting geographic diversity, racial diversity, cultural diversity.
But what about intellectual? Because there are people who they can be all separate, like you and me now, but I could just pick out all these people on the internet who could agree with my views and say, hey, let's go have a convention over in Oregon or something. Right. So even though people may come from different places, the like-minded people from those different places can still come together. I'm like kind of giving you a hard time here, but
no. No, I think the reason I use that example is because I think culture is often kind of a proxy for how people think.
Culture is more important. Is good rather than race. Yeah.
I'm just I guess I use that thought experiment to resist the urge to say that there is nothing to diversity whatsoever.
Okay.
I think there's something to it. I think it's a value that has to be traded off against fairness. I think, like you point out, each flavor of diversity is in competition with each other flavor of diversity. So trade-offs are inherent, even within the concept of diversity. Even if you were to consider that the master value, which I don't, and it's not obvious to me where to find the trade-off between diversity and fairness. I think at the moment, probably overshooting, just based on how much people are lying about affirmative action. People are lying about it. They're saying the reason that not enough black kids would get into Harvard if it were just based on SAT scores is because of systemic racism. Right. That is a lie. That is not true. And I think a lot of people know that it's not true. Just based on how much people are lying about affirmative action, people are lying about it. They're saying the reason that not enough black kids would get into Harvard if it were just based on SAT scores is because of systemic racism. Right. That is a lie. That is not true. And I think a lot of people know that it's not true.
In the annual report produced by the National Association for College Admission Counseling, they suggest that academic performance in high school has been the most important factor as far as admissions are concerned for decades. And then when you look into what's happening as far as grades in high school, you see an interesting phenomenon being discussed where grade inflation is actually happening in more affluent neighborhoods than poor ones. Now, I wanted to read some interesting things that I found in this paper in regards to legacy status for admissions. Thwarted applicants often perceive that their spots were given to arguably less qualified students admitted for non-academic reasons. The reality is that so many academically exceptional applicants are rejected by the nation's most selective post-secondary institutions that removing non-academic characteristics from the admission process would be unlikely to change the number of rejection letters received by any given applicant. Now, this part goes into how legacy admissions negatively impact the idea of diversity in colleges, especially at these Ivy League schools. But I wanted to read this second part. The heightened admission rates of legacy candidates among applicants at Ivy League institutions, coupled with the fact that as of 15 years ago, nearly 96% of Ivy League alums were white, could help to preserve racial homogeneity within these schools.
Well, this is a story everyone is talking about. Dozens of coaches and affluent parents now charged in connection to the largest case of suspected college admissions fraud in U.S. history. That includes some Hollywood actresses, Lori Loughlin and Felicity Huffman. Prosecutors say 8 different colleges, including Yale and Stanford, admitted students with inflated test scores or fake athletic records paid for by their parents. Now, the owner of an elite college prep business is also charged at the center of this scam. But for some, the real scandal in this scam is what's legal. Alicia looks into the prevalence of legacy admissions in today's Digital Dive.
Yeah, that's right, Lauren. This isn't really a new practice. It's known as what you just said, legacy admissions, where alumni contribute to their alma maters with the expectation of special treatment for their kids. This is also known as bribery, but this is perfectly legal. Now, what those actresses and other wealthy celebrities allegedly did was part of a larger suspected conspiracy, which is cheating on tests and bribing coaches. But this morning, we're going to stick to legacy admissions and focus on that. Now, not only do studies show legacy applicants have a significantly higher chance of getting in, but according to a U.S. News and World Report study, nearly 3/4 of the top 100 national universities gave preference to legacies. According to Harvard, today legacy students make up around 14% of the undergrad population, and applicants were accepted at a rate of nearly 34% from the years 2009 to 2015. That is more than 5 times higher than the rate for non-legacies. That's according to a study commissioned by Students for Fair Admissions. This, though, is starting to spark outrage not only on social media but on campuses around the country. Students like this USC student asking to ban these legacy admissions, calling this the biggest scam in American higher education.
Changing my whole life to come here, doing all that work, and I don't know. It's weird to think that there are people on this campus that didn't have to do any of that and are still here.
I mean, the idea is that the system is built for white people, and that somehow Asians are doing much better than white people at getting into Harvard. Why? Why would they be doing it better than white people in a system that is built for white people? It makes no sense. Why would blacks from the Caribbean, or I shouldn't say blacks, I should say people of African ancestry from the Caribbean, why do they make up half of the black kids at Harvard and Princeton, even though they only make up 10% of America's black population, right? Like, it doesn't make sense that they would be doing so well, although there are immigration selection effects, of course. But skin color is not the only variable here. There are cultural differences, and people are just lying about the policy.
Yeah.
I'm not entirely ecstatic about the idea of Harvard being 2% black and 45% Asian, something like that.
Yeah.
I'm not ecstatic about it, but I'm not ecstatic about nor am I ecstatic about Harvard currently. And the fact that, a black kid could score a couple hundred points lower on the SAT and get in, when an Asian could have a perfect score and not get in. So none of these outcomes make me particularly happy. Like I said,
the right is willing to do what is necessary to maintain a negrophobic social order, even acknowledging that Asians are discriminated against and admitting more Asian students into institutions of higher education. Strikingly, the Student for Fair Admissions complaint argues not only that Asian Americans are a minority, too, but that they are the most discriminated against minority, doubly burdened by white hostility on the one hand and affirmative action programs designed to help black people on the other. Asian Americans, the complaint suggests, have displaced blacks as the most disadvantaged group in society. They are, in effect, the new blacks. It is often said that Asian Americans are used as pawns by the right in affirmative action issues. But in fact, as the video clip shows, Asian Americans are standing alongside Ed Blum, front and center in the fight to dismantle Harvard's affirmative action program. The Asian American Legal Foundation, a Chinese American organization formed to bring the Brian Ho anti-affirmative action lawsuit against the San Francisco Unified School District in the 90s, along with the Political Action Committee 8020, filed a complaint with the U.S. Departments of Education and Justice charging Harvard with discrimination against Asian students. This complaint was meant to work in tandem with the lawsuit against Harvard, and the complaint quotes the Harvard brief at great length, the Students for Fair Admissions brief at great length. And by filing the complaint with the U.S. Departments of Justice and Education, they've brought the Trump administration into this legal and political battle. In addition, as I'll show, the amicus briefs submitted by the Asian American Legal Foundation in recent Supreme Court cases craft an argument about anti-Asian bias that serves as a template for the Students for Fair Admissions lawsuit against Harvard many years later. What we are witnessing is the emergence of a political phenomenon that has just begun to attract scholarly attention: the mobilization of conservative, professional, middle to upper class, first-generation Chinese Americans via Chinese language apps and social media networks into a formidable anti-affirmative action fighting force on a national scale. Although they represent only a small minority of Asian Americans, these activists claim to speak for all of them, and their dramatic confrontational rhetoric and modes of organizing have mostly drowned out the voices of the majority of Asian Americans who support affirmative action. In Grutter v. Bollinger, the first U.S. Supreme Court case to deal with race-conscious admissions after Bakke, Barbara Grutter, pictured here on the left, a white woman, was rejected by the University of Michigan Law School and filed suit claiming that the affirmative action program discriminated against her. So in this case, the briefs for petitioner and respondent briefly mention Asian Americans, but I want to focus on the amicus brief submitted in support of Barbara Grutter by the Asian American Legal Foundation, the group I've already mentioned. Again, foreshadowing the arguments that would be made in the Harvard case a decade later, more than a decade later. So the Asian American Legal Foundation amicus brief in Grutter says that state actors are, quote unquote, have been freed from the constraints of any remedial purpose, are running amok with their racial schemes, arbitrarily designating certain groups as preferred and others as non-preferred, in a grotesque project of Kafkaesque social engineering. What makes the university's program especially repugnant, the brief suggests, is the long history of discrimination against the Chinese. In a perverse sociometric move, the brief implies Asians, already burdened like blacks, are now, because of affirmative action, even more disadvantaged than blacks. There is no mention of historical discrimination against blacks. There is no mention of the integrationist intent of the law school's admissions program. One could be forgiven for wondering if the law school's admissions program was designed specifically to persecute the Chinese. This brief relies upon a highly selective reading of history. Consider how it cites two cases, Ganglam v. Rice, 1927, Lee v. Johnson, 1971, as proof of Chinese Americans' bona fides as civil rights warriors. In the former case, attorneys for Chinese American Martha Lum argued that she should be allowed to attend white rather than colored schools in Jim Crow, Mississippi, on the grounds that the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment protected the Chinese too. From what? From the dangers of associating with black students. This is an interesting use of the Equal Protection Clause. In Lee v. Johnson, attorneys for Chinese American children in San Francisco argued they should not have to obey a desegregation busing order, because doing so would disrupt Chinese cultural instruction. Chinese Americans fought against racial classifications in education in both cases, it is true, but in ways that reinforced the segregation of black students.
So there was this big case at Harvard where it's essentially Asian Americans against affirmative action. I think it's only fair that we look at what was said about Harvard's admission process in this court case. Harvard's admissions program has been designed and implemented in a manner that allows every application to be reviewed in a holistic manner consistent with the guidance set forth by the Supreme Court. Further, the court concludes that while the admissions process may be imperfect, the statistical disparities between applicants from different racial groups on which SFFA's case rests are not the results of any racial animus or conscious prejudice, and finds that Harvard's admissions program is narrowly tailored to achieve a diverse class and the benefits that flow therefrom.
What they would say to you, and I know this will sound probably just alien to your ears as someone not born here, is that you are not just an individual. That's what they'll say. You're not just an individual. You are a member of a group. You are a black person. You are a black American. You are part of this historical group that has been oppressed. And your fantasy of individualism and bootstrapping is just that. It's a fantasy. You can't operate outside of the context of history. They'll say things like, don't pretend history didn't happen. Don't pretend history just goes away is a common thing to say. We haven't come to terms with the legacy of slavery and Jim Crow. And it's all well and good if you as an individual can rise up. But there has to be an effort to have the group rise up.
I mean, I think there is truth to, like, you're never alone, like, you're not an island. But I don't know if my support is from people I don't know and never met and don't really know anything about me. Like, you do need social support, but not from there.
But what they'll say to that is, I get this argument all the time. Okay, well, you don't know, I know you don't know every black person, but when the cops pull you over, you have a shared experience. You know something, you have a brotherhood or sisterhood with your fellow black people that white people can't understand. Because you get treated, you're seen as black, you get treated as black, and white people can't get that. And therefore you have a fraternity or a sorority with other black people. And that gives you an obligation, it should at least give you an obligation, to carry the group forward somehow and get rid of this fantasy of individualism. I'm ventriloquizing people I disagree with right now, but this is what gets thrown at me. And you, I suppose.
We have to remember that she only considers the suffering of black people outside of America. The suffering of black people inside of America is invalid to her.
Yeah, but I don't know. When I think about black people suffering in the world, I do not think about Americans. I think...
Now, if we're listening to the argument that's being presented here, what they're telling us is that it's unfair for us to look at black immigrants and expect some type of understanding of our struggle. It's unfair for us to expect that they find some type of common ground with us. It's unfair for us to expect them to identify with blackness in the same way that we identify with blackness. They can reject us and receive acceptance from the greater society. In fact, they're actually incentivized to show up in their blackness and reject everything that we identify with blackness. But yet, if we take on the same stance in our dealings with them and we aren't welcoming with open arms, then we are seen as immoral.
Coming here from Nigeria, I didn't have a lot of context about race, example. So I never identified as black until I came to the US because the concept of blackness was never a thing.
Yeah.
Because over there it's the default to be black. So you didn't have to define it. So I didn't even understand what black was until I came here. And even then, I didn't understand, I didn't know the concept of slavery. I didn't know the concept of the Middle Passage. So coming here, I was like, all right, cool. There's people who look like me and people who don't. When I graduated from high school, actually, my junior or senior year of high school, I did a couple of essay contests that I actually won. And I won NAACP AXO award for this essay and something else. I can't remember another, I ended up winning money. And the essay was, do you think black people should get reparations? And I was like, no, you didn't work for it. And I won awards. People were like, yes, great point.
Yeah, I've definitely gotten it thrown at me. I've mentioned it, I think, when I did I went on Stephen Molyneux's show once.
Okay, so we've talked about the family, and that's one of the things people find controversial about you. I think really, though, the one that you didn't mention is the race and IQ stuff. This is something you dive into a lot, and I think people think that there is somehow a racist element to it. So I don't want to put any words in your mouth. So do you want to make your basic argument around race and IQ?
What is really frustrating for people, for groups as a whole, is looking at white people and not understanding why white people tend to be more successful. Because the IQ stuff just isn't really talked about. I mean, in fact, it's actively suppressed as a whole, which to me is tragic. It's incredibly tragic. I think that groups of similar IQs can get along fine. I think groups with disparate IQs can get along fine as long as people at least understand to some degree the fact that there's an IQ difference in aggregate, right? Not regarding individuals or whatever, right? And so what happens is, blacks and Hispanics and gypsies, low IQ there too, they look at white people and they say, what the hell? They have stuff and we don't. They have pools and we got to jimmy open a fire hydrant. They have nice stuff, we have crap stuff. They have peaceful communities, we have violent communities. They have stable families, we not so much. They do well in school, we not so much. They have patents, we not so much. They go to college, we not so much. Without the understanding of it, I mean, at least there's other stuff, at least the IQ differences. Yes, there's cultural differences, and yes, there may be testosterone level differences between whites and Asians and blacks and so on. But without at least understanding that, it's an incredibly frustrating thing.
Right. You know, I go to Poland, what is it, 99% white? I don't need any security. The streets are incredibly clean. Crime is almost non-existent. Nobody gets called a racist. There's no talk of white privilege. No identity politics. No endless diversity nagging. You know, I've spoken against white nationalism, but I'm an empiricist. I'm an empiricist. You know, I've spoken against white nationalism, but I'm an empiricist.
Like I went on Stephen Molyneux's show once, and also when you were talking about the whole Michael Brown incident, I think it was you were talking about, that when I was also in college at that time, and I remember going to the cafeteria to get myself some food, and there were these people outside, some black students who I had interacted with a bunch, actually, because I was very naive and unaware of this stuff. So I occasionally hung out with them, and then sometimes I felt kind of weird, but they were kind of nice. So I was like, whatever. And I hung out with other people, but they had these placards about, the shooting and da-da-da. I remember them looking at me, and I felt the pull, the social pull, but I was like, I'm late for class and I'm just grabbing my food.
So other black people befriended her, but as soon as they brought up an issue of injustice, she decided to distance herself from them.
Most importantly, I don't actually understand what this issue is about, because I didn't really know what was happening. And I just went away. But there's definitely you're almost expected to.
Okay, so a group of people have been friendly with you, and now you see them protesting a social issue. Maybe the expectation is that you actually try to engage with them, and if you don't know anything about the issue,
most importantly, I don't actually understand what this issue is about.
Maybe you should ask them so they can explain it to you, and then from there you could try to understand their perspective. Figure out why they feel so passionately about this that they're protesting.
Something else I wanted to talk to you about is the concept of black culture. I really don't like the term. I really hate that people think that a black culture exists. I really get annoyed with a lot of people in the US. It's always the US. I really think they're the ones that do it the most. Not only, but the most. To me, there is no such thing as a black culture. There's what people want to call black culture, and that's about it in my mind.
Do you think there's such thing as American culture or Jamaican culture?
Yes.
Why?
Because there are there's a shared cultural heritage. Heritage meaning history and ways of thinking and being, like the way we may express ourselves, such as language, religion, stuff like that. Yeah.
But I mean, every argument that says there's no such thing as black culture could be leveraged against the idea of Jamaican culture. Or I could say, well, I just found this Jamaican that doesn't have any of the same beliefs as you, thinks very differently, blah, blah, blah. See, so there's an exception, so therefore there's no Jamaican culture.
Well, I feel like that's different because the culture doesn't mean that you. I was gonna say the culture doesn't mean that you disagree, but in thoughts, but it would mean that, say, when I make a certain cultural reference, they're very likely to understand it, whereas someone outside of it might not. So if I'm talking about,
same is true of Black Americans.
Yeah, but Black Americans isn't the same as Black culture. Because when I think, the reason why it annoys me is like the whole, there's so many other people around the world. You know?
Yes,
like that's why
that I agree with. I think when in America, when people say Black culture, they're usually talking about Black American culture. Yeah, but sometimes they're talking about Pan-African, which I think I agree with you, is BS. There's nothing to that.
But once you make that statement, then I feel like I have to disown being Black, because then they're talking about something else. And like something that happened to me, and I talked to one of my Jamaican friends about. I didn't even bring it up with her, which is interesting. Like, it wasn't, because I feel like I would normally be the person to bring something up like that, because I talk about and think about these things. But she was saying that she didn't consider herself Black anymore. It's kind of like what your friend was saying. And like for me, it was the same thing, because I just didn't care about the word. I'd be like, oh yeah, I'm a Black person. It wouldn't mean much. But now, because there's so much weight behind it, I'm like, I just don't want to have that term associated with me anymore. But it never used to be that way.
And do you think it's all the talk of Black culture has turned you off to the identity label?
Yes, I think that for me, I actually spent some time like writing about this, like thinking about it and trying to understand my own perspective. That's the other thing. Once you come here, you have to like think about everything, because you're like, oh, well, am I really all these things people are saying? Like, you really have to question things. And I realized that I feel like I'm denying like other aspects of myself or other important parts of me because of the weight of the label. Like, people might think a certain thing. So it's not even that I consciously want to deny it. It's more like there are parts of me that are upset because my full person isn't being acknowledged. That's the right way to put it. Yeah.
So would it bother you if people talked about Black American culture instead of Black culture?
I think it would still, but a lot less. I think I would still be like, why not just say, no, I could see that there's like a Black American subculture, but I would be wary of it, because I would know that it still didn't represent everyone.
Well, Jamaican culture doesn't represent everyone in Jamaica. That gets back to my own point. Like, if you're going to talk about culture, you have to acknowledge that it's a very coarse-grained concept. There's always exceptions, but there's still regularities to be talked about between groups. If we talk about victimhood as an element of Black culture, like or Black American culture, sorry, as we've been doing in this conversation, I think that's a valid. It's hard to have that conversation without the notion of a culture.
Yeah, I agree with that. Like, you can't even discuss things without generalizing. That is true. But yeah, it does annoy me.
Our music, our food, our historical artifacts that show such a unique experience in this country. All of that means absolutely nothing to her. The only thing that allowed her to acknowledge the possibility of a Black American culture is this dog whistle that Black Americans complain too much. Very interesting.
That's why I wrote a piece called Black American Culture and the Racial Wealth Gap many months ago, which was the most viral piece that I wrote.
What was it? What was the main point?
The main point was that there is a 10-to-1 wealth gap between white Americans and Black Americans, and there's a narrative around it from people like Ta-Nehisi Coates, Marissa Baradaran, Richard Rothstein, and others, that we have to remedy this. We have to remedy this by anti-racist public policy, because it was created through racist policy, namely segregation, Jim Crow, slavery. So what we need right now is, if you're Ta-Nehisi Coates, it's reparations. If you're Richard Rothstein, it's government programs to almost force, but maybe just deeply incentivize Black people and white people to move into the same neighborhoods, to integrate more by somehow incentivizing them with money.
Isn't that just as racist though?
No, not at all, because these wouldn't be actions that are taken on the basis of race. These would be actions that are taken on the basis of our government's previous racial discrimination.
It's not anti-racist, it's also racist. It's trying to socially engineer the population and what happens to different parts of it via race. It's the same thing.
Yeah, the American government has already spent a century socially engineering a society that disenfranchises Black Americans. The only way to resolve this issue is to do the reverse and actually create a system that benefits Black Americans, specifically the ones who descend from American chattel slavery.
Yes.
It's a different motive, but it's the same action.
Yes. It's a different purpose, but it is the same action in the sense that it's social engineering. It's social engineering in reverse, which is just more social engineering. And I'm against it for that reason. I think most hugely ambitious attempts at social engineering like that fail miserably. They backfire.
No, the anti-Black social engineering worked out pretty well. I mean, if we just think about housing, looking at the Homestead Act, the FHA subsidies that built the suburbs, the racial covenants that locked us out of the suburbs, the redlining that devalued Black homes and increased the value of white homes. This has worked out very well. But now it's time to elevate the people that America locked out.
Yeah. But just to close the loop on that, on the piece I wrote, I found this data showing that Black Americans spend their money very differently than white Americans on the average. If you just look at the statistical median, Black Americans more likely to buy a luxury car in any given year, more likely to buy jewelry, more likely to buy expensive clothes. These are artifacts of Black American culture, I would argue, that have been pointed out by comedians like Dave Chappelle. Obviously, if you're a comedian, you can put the right spin on the point to make it funny. And that doesn't really translate well to my medium, which is written prose argument. But I was pointing out that this is something that it's more manageable if we could have a conversation about this and it didn't get shut down by the victim blaming meme every time someone mentioned it. It's possible that some progress could be made on that front.
If you found a study that supports this claim, why wouldn't you reference details from that study? Why would you reference a comedian? Maybe because you're full of shit. Now, what I'm going to do is go to the Department of Labor Statistics. I want you to get an idea of the type of income that is coming into Black households. Now I want you to look at our spending. If you take food, housing, transportation, healthcare, education, personal insurance, and pensions, we're looking at about 87% of Black household spending going towards the essentials. And looking at this pie chart, you don't see any slither for luxury items.
After all, this was Martin Luther King's fifth goal of his 5 goals, was to address the cultural lag.
Okay, if you were unsure about whether or not Coleman Hughes was a con artist, I need you to pay attention to this shit.
And one of the things that Dr. King specifically said... Sorry?
Could you go through all the five goals if you remember them?
I have them right here. I can just read them to you.
Yeah, read them.
Okay. This is from his Playboy interview.
He had a Playboy interview?
This is back when Playboy was doing really... Not that they're not doing high-minded things now, but they were actually a serious outlet in the 60s. Okay, this is Dr. King. We have 5 aims at the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. First, to stimulate nonviolent direct mass action to expose and remove the barriers of segregation and discrimination. Second, to disseminate the creative philosophy and techniques of nonviolence through local and area workshops. Third, to secure the right and unhampered use of the ballot for every citizen. Fourth, to achieve full citizenship rights and the total integration of the Negro into American life. And fifth, to reduce the cultural lag through our citizenship training program.
Now, Dr. King definitely did say this, except for when Dr. King is talking about cultural lag, he is not implying what they imply when they bring up culture. Dr. King is talking about a cultural lag that comes from insufficient housing, insufficient education, a lack of jobs. These are the main things that Dr. King is pointing to. While these two are arguing from the position that there's something culturally deficient about the American Negro, that we're not worthy of economic investment or any financial resources at all. Now, to put this whole thing in its proper perspective, I'm going to read this other part of the Dr. King interview with Playboy. This is Alex Haley. Along with the other civil rights leaders, you have often proposed a massive program of economic aid financed by the federal government to improve the lot of the nation's 20 million Negroes. Just one of the projects you've mentioned, however, the HAR-UAC program to provide jobs for Negro youth, is expected to cost $141 million over the next 10 years, and that includes only Harlem. A nationwide program such as you propose would undoubtedly run into the billions. Dr. King, about $50 billion actually, which is less than 1 year of our present defense spending. It is my belief that with the expenditure of this amount over a 10-year period, a genuine and dramatic transformation could be achieved in the conditions of Negro life in America. I am positive, moreover, that the money spent would be more than amply justified by the benefits that would accrue to the nation through a spectacular decline in school dropouts, family breakups, crime rates, illiteracy, swollen relief rolls, rioting, and other social evils. Alex Haley, do you think it's realistic to hope that the government would consider an appropriation of such magnitude other than for national defense? Dr. King, I do indeed. Can any fair-minded citizen deny that the Negro has been deprived? Few people reflect that for 2 centuries the Negro was enslaved and robbed of any wages, potential accrued wealth which would have been the legacy of his descendants. All of America's wealth today could not adequately compensate its Negroes for his centuries of exploitation and humiliation. It is an economic fact that a program such as I propose would certainly cost far less than any computation of 2 centuries of unpaid wages plus accumulated interest.
If I use that percentage, 6%, the debt balloons to $6.2 quadrillion.
And then later he talks about exactly what he means by that.
Do you see how many pages he's turning?
And then later he talks about exactly what he means by that.
The citizenship training program.
Yeah. Or he talks about the cultural lag.
Mm-hmm.
Yet Negroes must be honest enough to admit that our standards do often fall short. One of the sure signs of maturity is the ability to rise to the point of self-criticism. Whenever we are objects of criticism from white men, even though the criticisms are maliciously directed and mixed with half-truths, we must pick out the elements of truth and make them the basis of creative reconstruction. We must not let the fact that we are the victims of injustice lull us into abrogating responsibility for our own lives. Our crime rate is far too high. Our level of cleanliness is frequently far too low. Too often those of us who are in the middle class live above our means, spend money on non-essentials and frivolities, and fail to give to serious causes, organizations, and educational institutions that so desperately need funds. Yada, yada, yada. By improving our own standards here and now, we will go a long way toward breaking down the arguments of the segregationist.
Now, Dr. King did say this, but there's a lot of bullshit here. That Playboy interview happened in 1965. This excerpt that he's reading now is from Dr. King's book, back in 1958, called Stride Toward Freedom. But there should have been a clue that there's some fuckery afoot when he said yada yada yada. Now let's read some of this text that he left out. Through community agencies and religious institutions, Negro leaders must develop a positive program through which Negro youth can become adjusted to urban living. Since crime often grows out of a sense of futility and despair, Negro parents must be urged to give their children the love, attention, and sense of belonging that a segregated society deprives them of. That doesn't seem like Dr. King is putting blame on black people for their circumstances. But for further context, let's just go up a bit above where Coleman started. It must be reiterated that the standards of the Negro as a group lag behind, not because of an inherent inferiority, but because of the fact that segregation does exist. The behavior deviance within the Negro community stem from the economic deprivation, emotional frustration, and social isolation, which are the inevitable concomitants of segregation. When the white man argues that segregation should continue because of the Negro's lagging standards, he fails to see that the standards lag because of segregation. This whole section is not some declaration from Dr. King about his issues with the black community. This whole thing is about preparing black people for the arguments that they're going to deal with from segregationists. And he's essentially telling us to do everything possible to undercut their arguments. But he is in no way validating this idea that black poverty comes from some deficiency in black culture. Therefore, there's no need to invest in black people. There's no need to provide welfare or any other financial resources for black Americans. None of that is in this book. In fact, let's look at this section where he talks about economic insecurities and culture. Economic insecurity strangles the physical and cultural growth of its victims. Not only are millions deprived of formal education and proper health facilities, but our most fundamental social unit, the family, is tortured, corrupted, and weakened by economic insufficiency. And I wanted to end this with just this last part where it clearly outlines what Coleman Hughes is trying to do. In an attempt to influence the minds of Northern and Southern liberals, the segregationists are often subtle and skillful. Those who are too smart to argue for the validity of segregation and racial inferiority on the basis of the Bible set forth their arguments on cultural and sociological grounds. The Negro is not ready for integration, they say, because of academic and cultural lags on the part of the Negro. The integration of schools will pull the white race down. They are never honest enough to admit the academic and cultural lags in the Negro community are themselves the result of segregation and discrimination.
Yeah, when I think at the beginning you were asking me about what's the right way to respond to malice from people, and I think that is the best way. It's not this political stuff. It's self-work, but on a group level scale. Mm-hmm. You know, like that's the path to getting what you really want.
I'm afraid that project, I mean, Martin Luther King did well with his first 4 aims, but the 5th one, I just don't think it can happen in the current environment, because the second you mention like that piece got absolutely destroyed in the media, in my Twitter sphere.
Oh, really?
There must have been at least 10 pieces, one of them in the Washington Post, which was actually the nicest, the most charitable, but that just ripped into me for being just for trafficking in racist stereotypes. And it's interesting to me that in Martin Luther King's day, from his perspective, it was totally coherent to have the best interests for black people at heart and to point to the cultural lag. There was no sense in which anyone who pointed at the cultural lag was, quote, blaming the victim, in his mind at least.
Mm-hmm.
I think over time I started calling myself black rather than half Puerto Rican, half black, because there's much more to be gained in terms of social capital by calling yourself black.